Hello, and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar on improving parliamentary scrutiny of legislation. I'm Lisa James. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing this discussion. Legislative scrutiny is always on the agenda, but now feels like a particularly pertinent time to dive back into the topic. One of our speakers, Meg Russell, has recently published new research, which will shortly be appearing in the chat, asking whether it's true that scrutiny really has got worse in recent years. The progress of the assisted dying bill has put a spotlight on the private members bill process in recent months. And in a recently published memorandum, the House of Commons Modernisation Committee suggested that a deeper dive into effective legislative scrutiny might be a future work stream. So to discuss the past, present and future of legislative scrutiny, we've assembled a fantastic panel. Our speakers are Professor Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, Dr. Daniel Gover, Senior Lecturer in British Politics at Queen Mary University of London. And I should mention that Meg and Dan together are the authors of Legislation at Westminster. And Sir David Natzler, former Clerk of the House of Commons and an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Constitution Unit. Each of our panelists will speak for around 5 minutes. And after that, the four of us will have a brief panel discussion before we open up to audience questions. If you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And Hannah Kelly, who's here on screen, will select from among them and put the questions to the panel. By default, she'll also share the questioner's name, but you can submit your question anonymously if you prefer. And one thing you might want to consider when making that decision is that this whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. We'll be posting the video afterwards, and the event will also be available via the Constitution Unit podcast. So with my housekeeping done, let's get into the discussion. Meg is going to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Lisa. My starting point would be to emphasise that parliamentary scrutiny really matters. It not only ensures that government policies are considered transparently on the record, which brings democratic legitimacy, but also it can help to spot problems and avert policy mistakes. Yet there have been a whole series of articles lamenting the decline of scrutiny in recent years, and reports making similar points from a whole range of bodies like the Hansard Society, Institute for Government, Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and IPPR, as well as multiple parliamentary committees. As Lisa said, I've recently added to this literature with a new article in the journal Public Law, which was summarised on our blog a week ago today. Many of the complaints we've seen related to the extraordinary periods of the parliamentary debates over Brexit, followed by the COVID pandemic. My article sought essentially to do three things. First, to search for systematic measures and data that can be used objectively to assess claims of decline. Second, to not only explore whether decline in that extraordinary period was real, but crucially, whether it reversed once the crises were over. And third, to consider why these problems came about and what can be done to fix them. To cut a long story short, the article concluded that there's quite a lot to worry about, and that bad habits adopted during the Brexit and Johnson years became established, such that the performance of Rishi Sunak's government during 2022 to 24 was actually even worse. There's therefore a real challenge to improve things in this Parliament. I'll mention very quickly in these opening remarks some of the measures to give you a flavour, but you can obviously read the piece if you haven't done so already. I should say I don't say very much about overuse of delegated legislation and skeleton bills, as that's been so widely covered elsewhere, though there's clearly widespread concern about it. I start by showing how the number of bills rushed through the Commons increased steeply during this period. During the period of Brexit and COVID, perhaps this wasn't surprising, but the number of such bills was even higher subsequently. Looking at government bills starting in the House of Commons, just over half in the post-COVID 2021 to 22 session under Johnson were rushed through in fewer than 5 days. That compared to only 20 to 30% in the previous sessions I looked at during the coalition or under Labour. But the number of such bills later reached an astonishing 2/3 in the 2022 to 23 session under Sunak. There were some pretty egregious examples of rushed bills post-COVID. Some might remember Johnson's Health and Social Care Levy bill, which increased national insurance contributions following claims that he was going to solve the social care crisis. It was pushed through all of its common stages in a single day. In the subsequent session, once Johnson was gone, the same happened with the Health and Social Care Levy repeal bill. That one little vignette perhaps tells a story about the merits of proper scrutiny. Another measure is the number of government amendments to its own legislation. This can be a positive thing. In the book that Daniel and I published on the legislative process during the period 2005 to 2012, we showed that government amendments often come in response to points made by Parliament, which is healthy. We found very little evidence in that period of the government introducing bills before it had fully decided on its policy and amending them on the hoof, which can cut Parliament out almost completely. But there's been plenty of that in more recent years. One of the most striking examples I cite is in Johnson's Elections Bill, when provisions to change the electoral system for mayoral contests suddenly appeared only after evidence had been taken at the Commons Committee stage. Consequently, those changes were barely discussed in Parliament or in the media. When implemented, they went on significantly to benefit the Conservatives. Under Sunak, despite bills being subject to a diminishing amount of time for scrutiny, the number of government amendments proposed to them in Parliament also went sharply up. That's completely contrary to a culture of scrutiny. The addition of evidence taking in Commons Committee was an important innovation introduced in 2006. But analysis by the Institute for Government shows that in recent years it's applied to only around a quarter of bills. That's clearly a retrograde step. Likewise, the number of bills published in draft for pre-legislative scrutiny has significantly declined. All in all, it seems government bills are introduced increasingly unready, denying parliamentarians adequate scrutiny time and even bouncing them into late amendments, including sometimes in the Lords, meaning MPs have no chance to consider them at all. In the paper, I quote Sunak on one of his immigration bills, saying that proceeding in haste was a sign that the government wasn't messing around. This, I suggest, is a kind of macho politics that says scrutiny is just a form of time wasting. But cutting out scrutiny means not just cutting out parliamentarians, but cutting out experts, the media, and views of the public, and ultimately risking making bad policy that unravels later. A decline in the culture of scrutiny is something we should really worry about and demands serious action by both government and Parliament. I'm happy to engage in discussion after the other speakers about what that might involve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was a really comprehensive and useful introduction, and I think plenty to pick up on in the Q&A. But Dan, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. As has been said, I'm going to focus on private members' bills. That's to say legislation that's put forward by usually backbench MPs and members of the House of Lords. It's a topic that I've been doing lots of research into, and it's obviously become very topical recently, partly due to the assisted dying bill, but also some other bills as well. So I think a good place to start is with the system as it currently operates. Large numbers of private members' bills are proposed each year. Between 2010 and 2024, over 2,500 were introduced into either house. And since the 2024 general election, a further 140 have been proposed. Despite this, relatively few pass into law. Although that said, in absolute terms, the numbers are still significant. So there have been 110 since 2010. These numbers grew towards the end of the previous Conservative government, incidentally, the same periods that Meg has just been talking about. And the numbers do compare quite favourably to some other parliaments, similar parliaments elsewhere. And these bills can also have wider effects. And this is something I've been looking into in my research. They, for example, enable parliamentary debates on issues of interest to MPs. They can have agenda-setting effects, for example, appearing in a subsequent government bill, and a significant proportion achieve media coverage. So there are some things about this process that do currently work well. That said, there are also some weaknesses, and indeed the assisted dying bill has, I think, highlighted some disagreements over when it's appropriate to legislate using a private members' bill. In practice, most successful private members' bills, by which I mean those that pass into law, are small and uncontroversial. And in part, that is because it's so easy for opponents to block the bills, for example, by talking at length. In addition, most have significant government involvement behind the scenes. Most of the bills that passed were handouts, that's to say, effectively government bills in all but name. Sometimes ministers do agree to draft proposals that have genuinely originated elsewhere. And occasionally they will back a bill after it's been introduced, although that is fairly rare. For some, this situation has advantages. It means, for example, that successful private members' bills will usually have been through a government formulation and sign-off process, in contrast to what happened on the assisted dying bill. But it does also mean that private members' bills are effectively an extension of the government's own programme. And I think this is also a missed opportunity for MPs to really put ministers on the spot on issues that they might not want to be questioned on. As a consequence, some have argued that it should be easier to use private members' bills to vote on more controversial and genuinely independent proposals. Hence, one criticism the Procedure Committee made of the system almost 10 years ago was that they're either hand out or talked out. That was a slight exaggeration even then, but it remains largely true today. So if we do want private members' bills to be used for genuinely independent and potentially controversial or contested causes, we probably do need to think about reform of the system. And I think this can't simply be about making it easier to pass the bills. It also has to be about ensuring that they are subjected to sufficient scrutiny along the way. A good starting point is the Procedure Committee's recommendations from around 10 years ago, some of which could be revisited. Probably its most important was for a guaranteed vote on some private members' bills, perhaps through formal timetabling. Another recommendation was for some bills to be prioritised on merit rather than leaving it entirely to a random ballot, perhaps with the Backbench Business Committee playing an important role in that. In addition, though, I think the assisted dying bill has also highlighted some additional issues. One is a complaint that the bill wasn't subject to pre-legislative consultation, and Westminster could perhaps learn here from the Scottish Parliament, where there is an expectation that what they call members' bills are consulted on. The innovation of evidence sessions on the assisted dying bill has, I think, been positive, and I would say that because I was one of the people that called for it. But there have been accusations of bias in witness selection, and so perhaps some improvements could be made to the process there. And there have also been some questions about the appropriate role of government ministers on such bills. So in sum, I think there are some things that work well with the private members' bill process, but there are also areas where it is in need of reform. And I'm glad that the Modernisation Committee intends to look at private members' bills, and I hope that it will wait until the lessons can be learnt from the assisted dying bill before doing so.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dan. And last but not least, over to David.
Good afternoon. I'm going to try and avoid specifics, especially on private members' bills and on the assisted dying one in particular, and also avoid my shopping list of 10 propositions for change, which I made at the Study of Parliament group before Christmas. But actually, most of those will be set in my 5-minute grumble. So, in the broadest of terms, what we want is that the Commons should value the ongoing legislative process and positively value legislative scrutiny by its members and staff, at least on equal terms with topic scrutiny. So somehow we need to encourage at least some MPs to act and think like legislators and not primarily as advocates. Now, one way to demonstrate that the legislative task is worth undertaking is to tell a clearer story on each bill as it goes through the Commons now. Now, other than fine studies like Meg's and some individual case studies that we've had over the years, little is actually readily graspable about what happens to bills now. The media just echo the tweets they get from the stakeholders, those for or against. They look for exclusives and therefore don't attend most publicly available meetings of public bill committees. And they paint any genuine cross-party legislative endeavour as a rebellion, which is simply infantilizing. It's not easy for anyone to discover what has actually taken place in the Commons, and particularly in a public bill committee, other than endless hours devoted to reading Hansard. So, for example, on the tobacco and vapes bill, which is a waiting report and which finished a month ago, I'm having some difficulty in discovering what, if any, significant changes were made or discussed in committee. So one suggestion is that the House, and therefore the public, could get a real report of some sort for consideration. And the report stage of bills, as many of our listeners will know, is actually meant to be consideration of report, but there is at the moment no report. Secondly, parliamentarians and the public should be actively engaged in finding legislative solutions to the real issues. At the moment, that is left to stakeholders, lobbyists and officials, including drafters. The pre-legislative scrutiny, as Meg said, has pretty well lapsed. It's a confusing term. All it means is public examination, discussion of a draft bill before ministers have taken decisions. So although it is pre-legislative, it doesn't mean that in some way it's undermining the legislative scrutiny that carries on after this early look. Secondly, I think evidence, such as Dan was referring to on the assisted dying bill in a public bill committee on a private member's bill, which was a first, but evidence should be taken as a matter of course on all bills. That means including so-called Lords starters, in other words, those that started in the Lords, which are excluded now purely by convention and not by a rule, but also, and one would imagine with more difficulty, bills that go to committee of the whole House. You would need to have a specially appointed small ad hoc committee of members. But it doesn't really matter who asks the questions in these committees. The important thing is the answers from the witnesses you have and the memoranda they provide. And thirdly, public input into the whole legislative process, rather than just being grudgingly admitted, should be actively facilitated. Thirdly, the existing time and effort that goes into legislative scrutiny needs refocusing. We need to protect time for second reading and report so that it isn't eaten away by endless statements and urgent questions. I think we need to change public bill procedure to debate and decide each clause one at a time with a question and answer starting, and then proceed to amendments. And I will briefly mention assisted dying. On having read some of the Public Bill Committee proceedings, there are some really good debates going on, but they have to go on the basis of amendments that discouragingly to the members are always found to be unsatisfactory in some way. So if they want to have a debate on what sort of consent can be given, you should be able to debate that and then come to specific amendments with some possibility of tabling them in the light of that debate, rather than guessing what may come out to be a bit of a consensus view and hoping that you've got an amendment down that will somehow match that view. Thirdly, when the government brings forward slabs of new stuff on report, and it always will, as Meg noted, where we can't avoid that, then the bill should be recommitted to a committee. That's why that procedure exists. And when the government amends its bills at the very last moment, which is report, or technically third reading, but more likely report in the House of Lords, similarly, the Lords' amendments should be properly handled by being recommitted to the committee that considered the bill. And the worst thing of all, of course, the report stage. Somehow we have to find a way of having a series of short debates on specific propositions with ministerial answers rather than one enormous group. So do something, somehow, as they do in the Lords, helped by delaying decisions to the end. And finally, Lisa, you'll be delighted to hear, finally, I think we all need to recognize what is good about the current system. For example, grouping of amendments is a good thing. I don't know if there are any French listeners, but they don't ever seem to have grasped that. Programming ends the nonsense of all-night report stages and public bill committees dawdling through clause 1, begging to be guillotined so they can race to the end. But at the same token, we must now learn constructively from a lot that we know about other similar jurisdictions. That's the House of Lords, obviously Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I don't know if Art is listening, even the Republic of Ireland. I mean, let's really learn from what others are doing, because there are signs of legislative scrutiny elsewhere. But the biggest single thing we can do is together to change the mood and not just criticize legislative scrutiny, but show that at times the Commons is not acting as a rubber stamp now, and that it doesn't have to be one. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. I think there's lots for us to get into there. If you're in the audience, do start submitting your questions. We're going to have a short panel discussion, but we will be coming to audience Q&A in due course, so now is the time. Meg and Dan, I wonder if I can start just by drawing you out a little on what these recent experiences show us about the differences between government bills and private members' bills in terms of the scrutiny that they receive and the challenges that there would be scrutineers face. One of the things I'm struck by on the assisted dying bill is that it's had a good amount of time between its stages. As Dan said, mechanisms have been found to bring in expert evidence. The quality of the second reading debate has been quite widely remarked upon. And yet it has also been the focus of quite a lot of people concerned about the level of scrutiny it receives, perhaps in contrast to many of the government bills that have had perhaps less happy experiences. So are there things we should be drawing out about the distinction between how these different types of bills are treated?
You want me to go first? I think the assisted dying bill, it's obviously a fascinating process. And I think in a way it's done us a service here, because coming very close to the beginning of this parliament, it's focused a lot of people, including new members of parliament themselves, on the importance of scrutiny. And it's been really striking how there's been so much debate about whether this private members bill, albeit a tremendously important private members bill, has got adequate scrutiny, whether it's hearing adequate evidence. I mean, the Hansard Society, if anybody's not listening, do go and listen. They're doing a podcast specifically on this bill, and they're reporting every week on what's going on the committee stage and educating people about some of the problems, shortcomings of the committee stage process and the amendments process, as David is referring to. The fact that Dan and I in our book drew attention to probing amendments in the House of Commons, and how if you want to get a discussion going, you have to put an amendment down just in order to get a conversation going. And that makes it look like so many of these amendments are actually complete failures, when they were never meant to pass. They were just meant to get a conversation going. So some of the strangeness of that process, I think, is coming out on assisted dying. But what we need to do is transfer that over to be equally critical about the amount of scrutiny that government bills are getting. Because although my piece only goes up to the Sunak government, it was actually the first draft of it was written before the general election. The new government came to power on a promise that they were going to look at all this and things were going to improve. It hasn't been brilliant since either. We've seen some bills rush through. We've seen people complaining about overuse of delegated legislation on some bills. So the fact that new members in this parliament are realizing early on that scrutiny is very important, I think, is a positive thing. And I hope that it will spill over into a critical assessment of the government bill process, as well as the private members bill process.
Great, thank you. Dan, can I bring you in on this question as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I agree with all of that. I have to say, I found it quite interesting to read Meg's paper in the light of the discussion that we've just had around the assisted dying bill. I mean, I think in broad terms, I mean, there've been all of these complaints about scrutiny of the assisted dying bill, some of which I think have something to them. I do think that the private members bill process is less flexible than a government bill process. It's less easy to add additional time and so on. But in general, I mean, if I just look at the categories that Meg mentions in her paper, fast-tracked legislation. Well, this is not going to be fast-tracked. The second reading and third reading are going to be months apart. The number of days of scrutiny, it's going to have more than the 10 days that are in Meg's table. There was all this controversy about the assisted dying bill being published 18 days, I think it was, prior to the vote. Well, you compare that to Meg's article, illegal migration, published just a few days prior. And I mean, some of this is about the fact that the assisted dying bill, of course, is a very controversial bill. It deals with matters of life and death. But I think it's difficult to say that the illegal migration bill was not also highly controversial. So, yeah, and also late government amendments. I mean, there's been criticisms around the High Court's role being taken out of the assisted dying bill, following evidence actually in the Public Bill Committee. you compare that to what Meg writes about the Levelling Up Bill, where lots of provisions are added very late in the process. So, I mean, I think, look, an optimistic way. I mean, sometimes complaints about procedure are really about the substance. You know, really what people are concerned about is they don't like the bill and they want to raise complaints about it. But I think a more optimistic reading, and I will give the more charitable reading, is that people genuinely do care about parliamentary scrutiny, that this bill has highlighted some of the ways in which scrutiny could be improved. And if that's right, then I absolutely agree with Meg. You know, this needs to also affect how we think about scrutiny of government legislation.
Great, thank you. David, I wanted to come to you with a question, picking up on what you said here, and also on your comments at the SPG that you alluded to, with a sort of a roadmap for reform, to ask at a sort of high level, what do we think good scrutiny is? You know, what does it look like? It strikes me sometimes in these discussions that we all feel we know good and bad scrutiny when we see it. And I've tried to note down some things that have come out of this discussion so far around the provision of adequate time, bringing in expert and public voices, trying to focus debate on the substance. But are there criteria that you think, you know, people like us who may want to frame potential reforms or assess potential reforms should have in mind when we're thinking about what good scrutiny actually is?
Yes, I wish I knew. I think one difficult point is that it's only really afterwards that you know. And we can tell when there's been bad scrutiny, when legislation comes through that is no good, and which members themselves, including those who proposed it, would admit, and indeed politicians and probably the drafters and others, that they feel bad about. And that if it had been properly talked through, then that wouldn't have happened. Or they find that they've something that has arisen as a result of some statutory regime issue was just simply overlooked, which is human nature, but which in good scrutiny wouldn't happen. I've been reading for quite a lot of the termination of pregnancy and the abortion bill proceedings from 60 years ago. And there was, I think it's right in saying, although Lord Steele feels that's not quite fair, no reference at all to the term at which an embryo might be carried. In other words, the subsequent endless controversy about 24, 26, 28 weeks. But there was massive discussion of other issues. And we don't know what we're missing on coming back to the endless assisted dying bill. I think the tobacco and vapes bill, newsagents in about 10 years' time will say, we did tell you that we couldn't really have a system where we're meant to distinguish between a 32-year-old person and a 33-year-old person when they wish to buy cigarettes. And we'll be able to say that was in the bill and they just couldn't be bothered to do anything about it, to be honest. So the problem is it's only afterwards that you can tell. I think one aspect is how far the people who have decided to give up or been asked by the whips to give up a lot of their time to scrutinizing it, themselves feel at the end that they have done a reasonable job. Now, of course, there tend to be two sides, you know, you're for it or against it, but it isn't always like that once you get into a public bill committee. You know, you become interested in the subject. And I think many of them might feel frustrated and they may be worth asking what would have made that better. And it's my suspicion, that a possibility for, not very transparent, but for private deliberation is one simple way in which people who don't agree can come to agree without embarrassment about changing their minds or making mistakes or getting the wrong end of the stick, not understanding the subsection, and they can take correction and so on. So we all know from a select committee experience, if select committees had to deliberate in public, it would be hopeless. You need the privacy, and it's not just to do deals behind closed doors, it's simply to work out what the hell you think and what's going on, which is more easily done in privacy. But I don't expect that to be a popular proposition. And of course, there's nothing to stop members of public bill committees having informal private meetings in which they can discuss anything they like.
Thank you. Really interesting, and it's striking that a lot of this is about not just how processes might change, but also how they interact with the culture and the incentives facing people, and how those might need to change. And we may pick that up again a little later. But for now, I want to come on to talk a little bit about the mechanisms for improving legislative scrutiny, because improving scrutiny is, after all, the focus of this webinar. I've already mentioned the Modernisation Committee, which is one potential route. But I'd be interested to hear from anyone, I think, who wants to come in on this. How can we imagine reform coming about? Who can drive it? Who is likely to drive it in the current Parliament? Meg, I see you readying to unmute.
In the absence of anyone else readying to unmute, I think you said that much of this is cultural, and I think that's really important. I mean, to answer my own question as to why this has come about, I think it's fairly widely accepted that we've seen a sort of decline of culture of scrutiny, or commitment to culture of scrutiny, inside government and inside Parliament as well. In these difficult years that we had, when Theresa May was trying to get Brexit through, which was highly contentious in a Parliament in which she didn't even have a partisan majority and half her own party didn't support her, it's unsurprising that she tried to shut Parliament out. And in COVID times, Parliament was literally shut down in its standard form. And those who came in 2019 never really learnt the parliamentary culture of scrutiny in its normal form. So here we are with a new Parliament with those things behind us. There's a lot to rebuild, I think, in both government and Parliament. But rebuilding a culture is very difficult. I think we need to think about cultural change. There's procedural change. David has talked about some quite concrete procedural changes, and I know that he's got other ideas as well. I'm not sure whether he's yet mentioned the idea of being able to amend programme motions to get more time at committee stage, for example. But procedural change is quite difficult to achieve if you're looking to change standing orders, because the government often has, and even other party leaders sometimes, often have an incentive to try and block change because it's rather frightening to them that backbenchers might get more power. But I think there are also other things that can be done inside Parliament. I think essentially, I look back, I worked inside government in the period 2001 to 2003 for the Leader of the House, Robin Cook, who was in charge of the legislative programme. And at that time, I think we had a fairly robust process for checking if bills were ready to go into Parliament and not allowing rafts of late government amendments and so on. I'm not sure that was because the Labour government was sort of extremely virtuous. I think it was partly because it was quite scared. It was scared in particular of the House of Lords and how the House of Lords had the numbers and the power to overturn its legislation. So it wanted to get it into good order. So in a sense, Parliament needs to make government a bit more scared, to incentivize government to clean up its act. And I think there are various things that can be done there. I mean, I think the House of Lords, sadly, in the intervening years, has gradually been weakened by more and more people being put in there, it constantly being in the newspapers, ridiculed for being too big and for the quality of some of the members in there. The removal of the hereditary peers may give it a greater confidence. If we could clean up the appointments process, that would give it a greater confidence. But I think there are also things that can be done in the House of Commons without procedural change, which could be quite important. I draw attention in the paper to various kinds of data that it's quite hard, putting that paper together. I had to work quite hard and the people supporting me did too, to draw together bits of evidence like how many bills are being, it's not straightforward to work out how many bills are being rushed through in fewer than 5 days, for example, but it should be. I mean, that should just be routinely published on the parliamentary website, session by session. And if it was, people would be able to point their finger at it and say that the government's procedures, the government's approach to the system is declining, that it's allowing less time for scrutiny. So some of this can just be achieved through greater information provision and transparency of the process, as well as through procedural change, both of which I think can drive potentially cultural change. Sorry, that was a rather long answer, I think.
No, but that was helpful, and I think it sounds as though a lot comes down to things that Parliament needs to be doing, both on the political side in terms of making the government feel they can get away with less, and on the official side in helping to arm people with the the data and the information that you can use to push for change. I mean, one thing that obviously is an important kind of contextual factor in all this is the very, very large number of brand new MPs in the House of Commons at the moment. How should that huge turnover affect our thinking about this in terms of either what might need to be done and what can be done in helping this new group of MPs to engage with scrutiny, or what the mechanisms might be for doing it? David.
Yes, I mean, we mustn't overdo this thing about new members. They were all new once. And again, being boring, looking at the 1966 abortion bill, Public Bill Committee, the figures on that look to me heroic, because they were all beginning, this was 10 years before I started work now. But these were the figures of my youth. Two at least of my select committee chairs, but at that time they were new members. David Steele was a new member. So, and again, come back to assisted dying, and Daniel's obviously been reading the proceedings. They keep saying, I probably don't get this as I'm a new member. And I think in only one case is that self-evidently true. And most of the others seem perfectly capable of having perfectly sensible and interesting debates with one another on the subject. So we shouldn't worry too much about new members. Secondly, we mustn't despair of ModCom. It is a government-chaired committee, and if it doesn't want legislative change, then it will not happen through that route. They're not going to suggest things that we might want, I don't think, and I don't think necessarily the things they do suggest may be things that we would want. But there are other sources of influence in the House. Obviously, there are backbenchers, and there used to be backbench groups, cross-party backbench groups interested in parliamentary reform, improvement of scrutiny for its own right. And if we can revive that proposition and help encourage them. The other group that is never talked about are the panel of chairs. So they're the people who sit through Public Bill Committee hearings through the week after week. And I suspect that they are cross-party senior members. I suspect they too would have quite a lot of ideas and a willingness to push at some of them, because they know more than anybody else about the frustrations of that aspect of scrutiny of bills. So I would address them. The fourth thing we can do is to engineer a full-blown parliamentary crisis, as happened in 2009, and hope that we can get a right committee Mark II. But how we engineer such a crisis without bringing down Parliament, I'm not sure. And most cynically, because in the privacy of this private conversation, I can say this, is why don't we encourage Reform UK to adopt a legislative scrutiny reform programme? Because everything that Reform UK do, the other two parties seem to be leaping either on the same bandwagon or to outflank them. So if you can persuade Reform UK that this is all part of the anti-elitist programme of populist renewal, then maybe we'll get it through a back door.
Proposed parliamentary crises can be submitted through the Q&A. Dan, let me come back to you. We've mentioned pre-legislative scrutiny a couple of times, and that's obviously something that was very much part of the debate around assisted dying. Do you think there's more of a role that pre-legislative scrutiny and indeed post-legislative scrutiny should be playing more generally? Should we be thinking about how these can be used better to support scrutiny of legislation rather than really focusing on the point between introduction and royal assent?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly the role of pre-legislative scrutiny, it was always held up as one of the things that was going to make a big difference. And I mean, my sense is that it's used less than it has been in the past, and it's used less than it should be. I mean, the advantage of pre-legislative scrutiny, and Meg mentioned the book that we worked on a number of years ago now. I mean, one of the bills that we looked at had been through pre-legislative scrutiny, and various of the issues that were raised during that pre-legislative stage were then reflected in the bill as it was introduced to Parliament. So pre-legislative scrutiny can play a really important role in ironing out some of those issues before the bill is introduced. And that can be important, not least because once the bill is before Parliament, there's sometimes, I think, an incentive to just try and get it through, to try and weather the storm. And because making amendments, it can sometimes be politically embarrassing, it can take time, and so on. So I think the greater role that can be given to pre-legislative scrutiny, I think that would be a positive thing. And actually, if I could just take it back to private members' bills, which is, as you know, my obsession at the moment. I mean, there have been suggestions that you could have greater pre-legislative scrutiny role on private members' bills. It is, I think, more challenging because of the fact that we've got annual sessions, and at the moment the way in which private members' bills come before the House is, the ballot bills come through an annual ballot, and so how you actually build that in, I think, is challenging. But it is possible to envisage how you might do that, either by bringing the ballot forward, which is one of the things that the Procedure Committee has suggested in the past, or maybe by having a role for the Backbench Business Committee in maybe scheduling pre-legislative scrutiny before the bills are then introduced in a subsequent session. So yeah, that's what I would say on pre-legislative scrutiny. And then on post-legislative scrutiny, again, I mean, these bills, they get to the end of the process. In some cases, they're not even actually put into effect. And I think more attention should be paid to, are they having the effect that was claimed at the time? Where concerns are raised, I mean, David mentioned the vapes bill. I mean, again, it would be interesting to have a process of examining whether or not that actually proves to be the case.
Fantastic, thank you. We're going to come to audience questions in just a moment. So if you have been formulating something you haven't yet put in the Q&A, now's the time. But before we do that, I want to ask one final question of the panel, and I'm going to point this to Meg first. What about the House of Lords? We've been talking quite a lot about the role of MPs, the culture in the Commons, and procedures in the Commons. But of course, legislative scrutiny is an activity that takes place across both chambers. Are there reforms that we should be thinking about in the House of Lords? It's often said that the House of Commons has essentially outsourced detailed legislative scrutiny to the Lords. Is there anything more the Lords needs to be doing itself?
Yes, that's a very interesting and good question. I mean, I think in general, the House of Lords often looks good in these processes because it's contrasted with the House of Commons, and it does better than the House of Commons, but it's not perfect. I've already indicated that I think a more sort of confident and combative House of Lords, culturally, politically, I suppose that means, is one of the things that can most help concentrate minds in the House of Commons and inside the government. And at the moment, things are a bit confused by the proceedings on the hereditary peers bill at the moment. It's not quite clear, some of the Conservatives and hereditary peers themselves are rather upset about all of that, and so are behaving in a slightly obstructive way in the Lords, which is frustrating ministers. We haven't yet seen how this is going to settle in this Parliament. I think we'll see that after the hereditary peers bill has gone through. But just how challenging the Conservatives, combined with Liberal Democrats and crossbenchers, want to be on the government's bills is one of the most important things, I think, that will determine whether government bills are introduced in good shape or not. And that remains to be seen. I was going to challenge something that David said, actually. David talked about how bills starting in the House of Lords are not subject to evidence taking in the House of Commons, and they should be. I agree that it's always been a gap in terms of evidence taking on bills that start in the Lords, but I would say take it in the Lords. Because actually, if evidence taking in the Lords were taken on bills that start in the Lords, that would also encourage, I think, the evidence taking in the Commons to improve, because people complain, and we've been hearing that. Ruth Fox has been talking about that a bit on the Hansard podcast, how polarized evidence taking in Commons bill committees can become. On the assisted dying bill, polarized around the positions on the bill, but normally perhaps polarized around party lines, with some witnesses being seen as belonging to the government or belonging to the opposition, and some of them getting quite a hard time. Hard to imagine that happening in the Lords. If we introduce evidence taking on bills in the Lords, it would probably be a lot more sort of balanced and measured, and it might slightly put the Commons to shame and encourage Commons committees to improve. So I think if nothing else, the Lords can kind of help push the Commons in the right direction.
Great, thank you. And David and Dan, would either of you like to come in on this question?
Well, Meg's suggestion, she and I can pursue over a hot chocolate. I mean, I think she has a starry-eyed view of the House of Lords, which is completely driven by party considerations. There's a lower rate of rebellion than Commons. And also, if they took evidence, my theory is, although it would interest them, that no one else is going to notice it. Because if you want to engage elected members, I think it's better that they be the ones that take the evidence. But it's a very interesting thought. And I suspect the resistance to it might come on the grounds of timetabling. In other words, that the business managers don't want the Commons to do it, because by the time they finally got the bill out of the Lords, the last thing they want is any possible cause of delay. But I think it's a really interesting proposition and worth thinking through. No, otherwise, I think we should proceed. I have nothing to add to.
Okay, well, I can see we have a great wealth of audience questions coming in, so I'm going to ask Hannah to come back on screen. Here she is now. Hannah, what do you have for us?
Hello, we've had lots of really good questions. In the first group, we've got one from Amanda Weston, who addressed it to Meg, saying pre-legislative scrutiny is obviously a problem, but what about post-legislative scrutiny? For example, statutory reports to Parliament redacted and unpublished and recommendations ignored. Can more effective post-legislative scrutiny and judicial scrutiny meet some of the existing democratic deficits? Petros Chasanikos said, how do you think the scrutiny of secondary legislation could be improved? Would allowing amendments to statutory instruments help? And Sean Wilkins says, Sir David's suggestions for debates on provisions/clauses in a bill before amendments are tabled is very attractive. It will inevitably require more parliamentary time and could delay the process. So how do you sell that to a government who traditionally doesn't take a strategic approach to timetabling?
Okay, great. So we have the role of post-legislative scrutiny, how secondary legislation scrutiny can be improved, and how to sell reform to a government. Dan, can I start with you on this round?
You can, although I think all of those were addressed to other people. I mean, because I have to say, secondary legislation, I've always, it's something the Hansard Society has done an awful lot of work on. So I don't really have much to add to what they would have said. The one that interested me the most was was David's suggestion about having questions prior to the amendments on a piece of legislation, because it's one of the things that Meg and I looked at when we examined the legislative process. Was we have all of these amendments, and in fact we actually looked at whether or not MPs explicitly said that their amendments were probing amendments, which meant that they weren't intending to pursue this seriously as a change to the bill. They simply wanted to use it in order to spark discussion. And I think that there has to be a better way of doing it than that. And I was very taken by David's suggestion, but I do think the questioner is correct that this is likely to slow down the process, because you would need time, I think, to reflect on what the answers were before you then go away and think about which amendments that you're going to propose. I mean, some of this is sometimes, I guess, dealt with through the evidence sessions. When the minister is called to give evidence, they can be asked these more general questions that then allow amendments later. But I think that's a long way of saying that I very much liked David's suggestion, and I'm interested in how he would sell it to the government in order to get this through.
Well, let me throw that challenge straight to David. David, how do you persuade a government that doing things more slowly is a good idea?
Well, thank you. I don't think I do. So Sean, it was who raised the suggestion that, look, this vague proposition, it isn't a worked out proposition, would take more time. The first condition I would lay down is that it wouldn't take. The PBC would still have to be given the same out date as it is now, or else no one's going to buy it. But you would spend a lot less time debating amendments, because they would simply be a matter of deciding whether that was a way to give effect to a discussion you'd already had. So I don't see it as taking more time, but we would have to work out, as Dan rightly says, the interval between having this debate on, say, clause 1, or indeed subsection 1 of clause 1, and then coming to table amendments and indeed have a chance to look at them. And there's obviously a delay built in. So after clause 1, you'd look at clause 2, and you wouldn't really come to look at the amendments to clause 1 until maybe a little later. It's the same process if you're going through a draft contract with lawyers. You don't go through proposing amendments line by line. You try to work out what it's about, and then you start proposing amendments to take account of what you want to happen. But I'm really, I confess, I don't know where this is exactly done. Something like it happened once on report stage of one of the European bills, I think the Lisbon Treaty bill, actually on the floor of the House, that we had general debates followed by amendments on that subject. On the amendability of SIs, I'm completely out of court on this. I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to amend statutory instruments. It happened in 1920 and 21, and it's simply a nuisance to the government to make them amendable, and they think, why bother to have them? Why not put the stuff in the bill? But if that was what was wanted by the House, as long as both houses agreed the amendment, it could be done perfectly easily. And on post-legislative memoranda, I understood Amanda to say that they were not published, which I was unaware of. I mean, they should be published. Certainly they're not looked into enough by select committees, but then sometimes it's an act in which the memoranda suggests is going absolutely fine. And it'd be rather foolish to have a sort of ritual session on. But it is something which the Westminster Foundation for Democracy is busily telling countries all around the world is an absolutely crucial thing to do. So perhaps with the help of its enthusiasts in the Lords, someone should have another look at how it's actually going.
And Meg, do you come in?
There's very little left to say. There's an awful lot of sensible things have already been said on all three questions by both of the other speakers. I think I'm struck a little bit, and maybe it's just the nature of this round, that quite often when we're talking about the legislative process, we sort of talk about what else we can do around the edge of it to compensate for the problems with it itself. I mean, for years we've been talking about pre-legislative scrutiny, we talk about post-legislative scrutiny, we talk about cleaning up the delegated legislation process. And I think often we're having these conversations because there are problems wrong with the process itself. So I'm increasingly coming around to thinking that maybe we actually need to take a very big, bold look from beginning to end at the legislative process, and whether if we were designing it from scratch, we would design it in this way, or whether, I think David has articulated this, he articulated at the Study of Parliament Group conference, I think, whether we ought to have more space for members to be talking about the principles of a bill and which bills they want bringing forward, with perhaps less time spent on some of the more technical scrutiny. I mean, it's very striking that the legislative process is a highly technical process, but it's wrapped up in a very political process. And the political process is completely valid. It's democratic. It's a representative process. But we're also expecting members to focus on the minutiae of the wording of particular clauses and amendments at the same time. I think sometimes teasing all that apart and thinking whether there might just be a more rational way of doing it for the 21st century might be a good thing, which could be seen as a way of just avoiding all three questions, but I think they've been answered very well by the other two.
Well, on that note, Hannah, come back in and pose us some more questions.
Ruth Chambers says they were struck by the commonality of messaging from the Constitution Unit, the IFG and Hansard Society in their evidence to the Modernisation Committee on the need to improve parliamentary scrutiny of legislation. How can we make the most of the opportunity presented by the Modernisation Committee to secure some meaningful improvements? John Cartledge asks, is there any evidence for an appetite for procedural changes amongst members generally? And if so, why has the progress been so tortuous? And what can be done to change this? And anonymous questioner says, reflecting on Sir David's point on the need to encourage some MPs to think more like legislators, has this always been a challenge, or has it become more so recently? And if so, do panel members have any sense of why this has happened?
Really interesting. So how can we seize the opportunity of the Modernisation Committee? Do members actually want better scrutiny? And has it ever been thus? David, I'll bring you in first, if I may.
Well, there's always a tendency to think that our ancestors were better than us. I'm not sure that they were. I suppose, I mean, the obvious answer, which Megan Tye, as a professional, is a better, better position to give, is that members now have too many other pressures to which they have given way, and one can't blame them, about constituency work and acting as advocates for causes local and national and so on, and that they are taking part, even if they don't want to, in what to me seems a much more subjective, experience-driven sort of politics about lived experience, and that they seem to prefer making short speeches on compassion to being devoted to one particular legislative outcome. But I think we'd perhaps be unfair to think that. There's been a lot of laws passed in recent years which have the name of an individual attached to them because they were the victim of some statutory failing. And it is members who have chased these issues down. So that answers the second one a bit. No member is going to be interested in procedural change, I hope, or they're in the wrong job. What they should be interested in is what comes out of procedural change to make them better legislators and representatives and to produce better statute. So I don't think they will be opposed to it. They may be skeptical, but I assume they have a healthy distaste for all forms of procedure. So that coming on ModCom, I think I've already expressed my slight sense of pessimism. What they can do is, of course, stimulate other people, e.g. the Procedure Committee, or indeed someone else, to come up with ideas without a promise that they'll implement them. But with that route which is offered, which without a ModCom, there would be no such route.
Great. Meg, could I bring you in next?
Yes, just to pick up on the Modernisation Committee, obviously it held a consultation. It received, I think, 700 submissions from different people. So it's got quite a big agenda, quite a big ambitious agenda. But I was struck looking at the memorandum that they published a week or two ago, summarising what their priorities are going to be, that they listed some priorities, some things that they're focused on now. They listed 3 future priorities. And then within the area on future priorities, you saw this line, a deeper dive into effective legislative scrutiny should be a future work stream, which I think that was the future as looked at from the future, because that wasn't one of the 3 things that they listed. But I think they probably listed it precisely because, as Ruth says, quite a number of contributors actually drew attention to the legislative process and the need for improvement. And this is something that Lucy Powell, now Leader of the House, had drawn attention to herself when she was the Shadow Leader of the House, and had said that she wanted to right some of the wrongs that had crept into the system during the Johnson and Sunak periods. So I think there are quite a lot of people who are wanting to hold her to those words. And I think maybe that modernisation memorandum demonstrates that some of us on the outside who are quite agitated about these topics, perhaps we should be talking to each other and drawing up a programme for that future for the Modernisation Committee, in order that it's ready whenever they get to it. On John's question about members, I think I would come back to what we were just saying, what I said earlier about assisted dying. I think there is a bit of a moment here. We've got all of these new members, as has already been emphasised, which could go either way for scrutiny. They could be people who prove to be completely controlled by their whips, who, they don't have a culture of scrutiny built into them because they've all newly arrived. They want to focus on their constituencies or their party work rather than parliamentary work, and things could get worse. But on the other hand, assisted dying means that quite a lot of them are focused on, firstly, the quality of scrutiny, and secondly, thinking independently. And one of the things that happens, I think, when governments have big majorities is that there can be quite a lot of bored people kicking around on the backbenches who begin to make mischief. And I think that happened under the Blair government, 97 to 2001. And by the time we got to 2001, when Robin Cook had taken over as Leader of the House and I was working for him, there were a lot of ideas fermenting on the backbenches that people wanted to introduce to strengthen Parliament. And that happened. So I think there are some opportunities as well as risks in this environment.
Great, and over to Dan.
Yeah, I mean, Meg mentioned actually one of the points I was going to make, which is, I mean, I keep going back to private members' bills and the assisted dying bill for obvious reasons, but I do think, I mean, well, so the question from John was about whether MPs are interested in procedural change, and I mean, so many of them are new MPs. You kind of hope that they're not interested in something's if they're elected to the Commons and they've all got ideas for procedural change, something's gone horribly wrong with the electoral process, because that ought not be what MPs are interested in at the start. However, as they encounter some of the problems with the system, if they feel strongly about a particular cause and they come up against issues to do with that make it harder for them to achieve what they're trying to achieve, then I think that can then be a way of making MPs interested in how the system could be done differently. And so in that respect, I do think the assisted dying bill, because it's been such a high profile example, because questions of procedure are really central to that, because questions of scrutiny were really central to that. You know, I hope that it may help encourage MPs to think about how could the system be dealt with differently, how could things be done differently. Oh, and actually I was going to say, I mean, really just to agree with what David said on you know, MPs have got so many other things that they're doing with their time. Constituency work, they're trying to communicate in the media. It's hard to say whether that's changed over time, but I mean, the media and social media is clearly much more all pervasive. They're trying to communicate with constituents on a daily basis. And again, taking it back to private members' bills, I mean, we see this on Fridays. You know, MPs are prioritising being in their constituency over taking part in proceedings on Fridays on private members' bills for perfectly rational and logical reasons, because they see that as a better use of their time.
Hannah, what's in our next round?
Jane Northedge says, regarding the number of bills rushed through in less than 5 days, to what extent is this due to an increase in the number of bills rather than or in addition to other motives? Is the executive pushing through too much legislation because it can't influence change by other non-legislative measures? Paul Evans says, is it an oddity that in the last 40 years, the resources given to support select committee scrutiny has doubled and redoubled and grown further, while support for legislative scrutiny has scarcely changed? Is this disparity inevitable? Is it right? Should it be addressed? And Mark Geddes says, I am interested by the discussion of evidence gathering, which has come up a few times. How would you evaluate the effectiveness of the existing processes to gather and use evidence, for example, by bill committees? How do you improve their effectiveness? And do you need to take witness selection out of the hands of the whips?
Okay, so we have the volume of legislation and speed, resourcing within Parliament, and the effectiveness of evidence gathering. On the first of those in particular, let me come to Meg first.
I'd need to go back to the paper to see what it says about the number of bills and so on. But I think that, I mean, obviously, all of these metrics are very tricky, because there are large bills, you know, long bills, there are short bills, there are highly technical bills, there are highly political bills. Some of them are more controversial than others, and so on. So applying any kind of measures is a little bit dubious, which is why I think it's important to look at sort of quite a lot of data and long-term trends. But I think the short answer is no. It's not that they were trying to get through more legislation. They were just trying to get it through more quickly. And the figures, if you look in the paper itself on amendments, are really, really striking. That looks back over about 10 years, or 10 sessions, and the average number of government amendments per bill. And under Rishi Sunak, the average number of government amendments absolutely shot up at the very same time as the amount of time given per bill was going down. So I think that, you know, we've got to treat data with caution, but I think that there are some fairly strong indications that things are going in the wrong direction. I would say it's not just on less than 5 days, because the 5 days are 5 working. They're not 5 calendar days. they're 5 days across the time that the bill is discussed. So it's not that it's being introduced on Monday and passed by Friday. It's that 5 days of scrutiny have been devoted to it across time. Another really important measure is, as has been referred to, the gaps in time that allow for reflection and consideration of what amendments to propose and so on between stages. And I think that if Parliament were publishing data on the speed with which bills are going through, both of those indicators is important. The total number of days, but also the gaps between stages. And those gaps between stages, which are published in a thing called the Cabinet Office Guide to Making Legislation, which the government holds itself to, have been missed over and over again in recent years. And I think that Parliament should be policing that. In response to Paul Evans, I won't answer all of them, and Mark Geddes is being very cheeky because he's the world expert on evidence in Parliament and he wants us to answer the question. In response to Paul Evans, I'm very much inclined to agree with that. It's very striking how much not just resource but also attention has gone into the select committees in recent years. You see this if you look at the parliamentary website and what the House of Commons communicates about what it's doing. It's clear that the select committees have media officers and they're constantly saying what evidence they're taking, what topics they're considering, what reports they're publishing. You can find virtually nothing about what public bill committees are doing, virtually nothing about who they're hearing from today. I mean, David made this point about having a real report for report stage. I think we could also hear a lot more about what's going on bill committees during the period that they're meeting. And that would help transparency a lot.
Great. Dan, would you like to come in next on any of those?
Yeah, well, just going back actually to the first one about fast tracking of bills. So, I mean, I agree with Meg. I mean, I don't have the total number of bills in front of me, but if you look at the table in Meg's paper, for example, 2010 to 2012, 4 bills fast tracked, which was having all their common stages in one day. 2022 to 23, 11. So I think it's almost certainly, in fact, it will be the case that is as a proportion higher. It's not just in absolute terms. I wanted though to answer the question about evidence from Mark. And again, as Meg said, Mark is the expert on this. So I'm not sure I'm going to say anything that Mark doesn't already know. I have been looking at how evidence has been used on the assisted dying bill. And I've looked at previous bills as well. And I think at its best, it can be used to inform arguments. It has been used on the assisted dying bill to inform amendments. Particularly, there's been questions around what constitutes capacity to take a decision to end one's life. And there, Sarah Olney in particular, I noticed, has been really drawing on the evidence taken in the oral evidence sessions in order to inform her arguments and her amendments, and others have also been referring to the evidence as well. I mean, in terms of the question about whether or not selection of witnesses should be taken out of the hands of the whips, I mean, I think one of the interesting things on this bill is that I assume it didn't happen in quite that way. I mean, normally it's the usual channels, the whips of the two main parties in particular, that are heavily involved in selecting the witnesses. It seems that, you know, in this case, because it isn't a government and opposition bill, that hasn't happened. And I've noticed that there's been a lot more controversy around the selection of the witnesses. Now, that may just be because people make procedural complaints about an issue that they feel strongly about, but it may also be that there's something there about what is it that we're trying to do with the selection of witnesses? Because we can think about it in policy terms. We want the best witnesses who are able to give evidence that's going to improve scrutiny, but they are also serving some sort of political function. There's a legitimacy angle to what is going on as well. We want witnesses in order that they are able to give voice to views that exist in the country, irrespective of whether it actually changes the bill. And so I think I would have reservations about removing the role of whips entirely, because this isn't just about getting expertise. It is also about political balance, political acceptability, and giving voice to arguments. So it really comes back to the question of what is it that we're trying to achieve with oral evidence. And I think there are several things that we're trying to achieve, I think.
And David?
Well, little to say on the choice of witnesses. I think that I promise not to discuss the assisted dying bill much. I think the controversy was manufactured. There were obviously massive private discussions between the promoter of the bill and the principal opponents, particularly those who put onto the public bill committees to whom to have. They had, as you will recall, 1 hour's private discussion in the public bill committee, which, so far as I know, has never happened before, as a way so they could honestly discuss who they needed to hear from and who would be particularly valuable. And it was perhaps unfortunate that then became a public debate when they resumed in public. But the fact is, they had a remarkably wide range of witnesses, many of whom had already given evidence to the Select Committee on Health about 9 months beforehand. So I think, as I say, the controversy can be overstated, the real controversy. And I mean, there is, of course, the practical problem in a government bill that the time between second reading and the moment at which a witness list is put to the subcommittee of the Public Bill Committee is very short, and therefore some names have to be pre-booked so that they can turn up, because not everyone is able to drop everything and turn up and give evidence. So there are practical constraints on the choice of witnesses, which a select committee doesn't really face. But Mark knows all this, but for general information, that may be worth knowing. I don't know about rush through bills. Of course, Paul Evans is right. I mean, apart from that being a more or less a given of these sort of events, but of course, you say, and the point about the lack of publicity for which the House itself gives to its legislative proceeding, I'm embarrassed to admit I entirely agree, and it is something I failed to do anything about, although did talk about it. It is quite difficult because of resources, but the main difficulty, let's be candid, is the select committee has a chair, a clerk and staff, and has a real power center of their own, and they can get the resources. And over the years, from having one press officer, when I was a select committee clerk, now each committee seems to have about 1.5 each, doing nothing but saying what they're doing. And that is an absurd imbalance, given what the rest of the House is trying to do by legislative. So I think that's an extremely good point.
Could I just cut in and say we
yes.
haven't even spoken about the possible reform of public bill committees, and the Constitution Unit has a report on that published, I think, in 2011. Maybe they should be made more permanent and more expert, more along the lines of the select committees.
Well, that's a different issue, is it not? I mean, you could still have publicity for what's going on. For example, the House gives very little publicity to question time. It relies on the press to do that for itself. So there are balances you have to strike. And if I may take the liberty of being on board, as it were, to say, when I said the House should produce some sort of report about what had happened in Public Bill Committee, Andrew McCower on the Q&A has very helpfully pointed out the libraries do produce such a paper after the committee stage, of which I was aware, because again, I seem to remember encouraging it, but without wishing to criticize it unduly, I just looked at the one on the tobacco bill. It is 61 pages long. And to find out, you can find out what didn't happen in committee, and not much did. But you don't, to be honest, get a sort of 5-page grasp sense to someone who already knows the bill. Where are the gravamen? What was the important stuff that came up unexpectedly? Was it about the age of purchase? Was it about the extension to other tobacco products or whatever? So it's a very correct record, as it has to be, but it is perhaps a little on the unadventurous side.
Great, thank you very much. We could keep going much longer, and I know that we still have many great questions we didn't manage to get to, but it is 2:15, and so it's time for me to say many thanks again to our speakers, and thank you very much to Hannah for fielding the questions, and to all of you for joining us. You'll be able to find a video of this session soon on the unit's website and YouTube channel, and we'll be releasing the audio version via the Constitution Unit podcast, so do point others toward it. And join us for our next event, On the 24th of March, we'll be asking, are the UK's party funding regulations fit for purpose? With Jackie Colleen of the Electoral Commission, Jess Garland of the Electoral Reform Society, Mark Pack, Lord Pack, and Professor Justin Fisher from Brunel University of London. If you're quick on the draw, you can sign up via the link in our chat. Otherwise, you can find all the details on our website. But as for right now, that's it from us. So goodbye, and we hope to see you again soon.